king. They struck him and they cursed him and mocked his holy name. All alone he suffered everything. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world, and set him free. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone for you and me. When they nailed him to the cross, his mother stood nearby. He said, "Woman, behold thy son." He cried, "I thirst for water," but they gave him none to drink. And the sinful work of man was done. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone for you and me. To the howling mob he yielded. He did not for mercy cry. The cross of shame he took alone. And when he cried, "It's finished," he gave himself to die. Salvation's wondrous plan was done. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone for you and me. All right, our next song will be 71 as the deer. That's 7-1. Had to get the tune of the other song out of my head. Oh. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. I want you more than gold or silver, only you can satisfy. You alone are the real joy giver, the apple of my eye. You alone my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. All right, let's open up to Mark chapter 3 is where we're going to spend our time. It's Mark chapter 3. There you go. All right, so in Mark 3, Mark is continuing his record of the public ministry of Jesus. With that in mind, up to this point in his gospel, among the things Mark has been focusing on is the fact that as a result of the things Jesus was doing, he developed a very great following. He was becoming, at least at this point, very popular with the people. So since that's true, by the time we reach verses 7 through 12 of Mark 3, he summarizes what he has recorded so far about Jesus' public ministry, and does so by recording for his readers what seems to be two reasons as to why people followed Jesus in the way that he did, in the way that they did. So first, in verses 7 and 8, what we'll see is that Jesus was followed because of people heard what he was doing. We will come back to that thought. The second reason Mark records in verses 9 through 12 as to why people followed Jesus is that he was followed because he performed healings. He healed many. So these are two very basic points that we're going to spend time with today, but the application we'll take from this text that we'll look at again at the end of class is just in our service to Jesus. We have to ask ourselves, why are we following Jesus? And we'll talk more about that when we get there. But we'll read verses 7 through 12 of Mark 3, and then we'll look at the points. So Mark 3, beginning verse 7, we read, Jesus withdrew to the sea with his disciples, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, and also from Judea and from Jerusalem and from Idumea and beyond the Jordan and the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. A great number of people heard of all that he was doing and came to him. And he told his disciples that a boat should stand ready for him because of the crowd, so that they would not crowd him. For he had healed many, with the result that all those who had afflictions pressed around him in order to touch him. Whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they would fall down before him and shout, "You are the Son of God." And he earnestly warned them not to tell who he was. So again, in this short section, Mark seems to be recording for us a couple of reasons why Jesus was being followed. First, because people heard what he was doing. Now we see this point introduced for us in verse 7. Where does Jesus go? verse 7. Okay, but before that point, it says he withdrew to where? To the sea. So that's where he goes. Now, if we remember from the context of verses 1 through 6, Jesus was teaching in a Jewish synagogue. And we read about all the events that happened there with the man with the withered hand. He was healed. That brought up some dealings with the Pharisees. So that's happened. The Pharisees, based on verse 6, they're already plotting to see how they can destroy Jesus. But now Jesus has left the synagogue, and now he's gone to the sea. The sea here is probably the Sea of Galilee, because Jesus is still in that region. But Mark records this for us, his location. Now, why go to the sea? I mean, what's the difference between teaching at the sea versus teaching at a synagogue? Okay, good point. You're not stuck in a building. Are there any other reasons Jesus would go to the sea? Okay, that's true. We'll talk about that. Any other thoughts as to why Jesus would teach at the sea over and above a synagogue in this case? Okay, that's true. So yeah, I mean, that's speaking from the context with the boat. But something else to consider here is that the sea, it would be a little bit, oh, sorry, was there a hand up? Sandy, sorry, I didn't see you. I apologize. Okay, that's true. We're going to come to that a little bit later in the text with when we talk about the boat. But here in verse 7, the question we're trying to answer is just why the sea versus the synagogue. Another reason would be also because the sea would be a more neutral place. The synagogue, as we saw in verses 1 through 6, there's religious officials there, the Pharisees, people really keeping an eye on Jesus to make sure he's not causing trouble. At the sea, that's not necessarily the case. There's not as strong a presence of the religious leaders as there would be in a synagogue. So in short, it would be a safer place for Jesus to carry on his teachings. And in addition to that, is going back to Dean's comment, you're not stuck in a building. You have a lot more open area for people versus in a building, you kind of have to cram in together. So I don't have that information with me, but that's a good question to ask, what time of year this would have been. What's that? It can get warm there. Yeah. That's also true. So it might have been a cooler environment. So so this is where Mark tells us Jesus went, but he obviously is not going alone. Who's following him? A great multitude of people. That's what the text tells us. So among them would be some of Jesus' apostles that he's chosen so far, probably. But here Mark just tells us a great multitude of people. What's a multitude? A lot of people, a large crowd. And Mark illustrates that or paints that picture for us by telling us that these people came from all different places. Galilee, Judea. Moving on into verse 8, people as far as the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. Or from Jerusalem, from Idumea, beyond the Jordan, in the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. So this is all over the map. People are coming to follow him. Why? In verse 8, why are they coming? They heard what he'd been doing. So, news about him is continuing to travel, not just within the land of Israel, but some of these places are outside the land of Israel. So news is spreading about this Jesus fella who's doing these things. So Mark lists these places for us. Some of these we're probably familiar with. Galilee, it's where Jesus is home base right now. Judea is down in the southern portion of Israel. The rest of these places are off to the south, east, and north of Israel. So they're coming from all different directions. So people heard what he was doing. They're coming to him. News of Jesus is continuing to spread. Questions or comments on verses 7 and 8? All right. So the point we should see from verse 7 and 8 as to why Jesus was being followed is because people heard what he was doing. We have to remember at this time, they didn't have things like Facebook and the internet. But there was word of mouth, just traveling from person to person. Eventually, Jesus establishes himself a reputation. Not because he wanted to, but this is just the way things went. Jesus, we've talked about, he wasn't out for celebrity status. He was just doing what the Father wanted him to do. But all the same, news traveled, and people heard what he was doing. But Mark doesn't stop there. He goes, go ahead, Andrew. Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is what Mark's going to get into here beginning in verse 9. So this has already come up, but what Mark's going to get into in verses 9 through 12 is the healings of Jesus that he's written about so far. But beginning in verse 9, what happens? It's already been said once tonight. Wants them to get a boat ready. Why? Exactly, so he wouldn't be crowded by this crowd. So, as the text's verse suggests, Mark is recording a request from Jesus. Hey, disciples, the disciples here probably some of the apostles, and he's telling them, get this boat ready for me. We don't know who the boat belonged to. The point here is just that he asked for this boat to be ready. And all because of this crowd. What was this crowd doing that would prompt Jesus to ask for this boat? Okay, that's true. That was part of their intention. But what else is involved here? Okay, they just wanted to touch him. But Jesus asked for this boat. He wants to get away from the crowd. He's still going to teach, but he doesn't want to be crowded. Now, have any of you been crowded by people? What is that like? It's horrible. Yeah. Ever in a large crowd, people all pressing in around you? That's also true. Just not even the physical contact, just being in a large crowd. I'll be honest with you. I don't like being in large crowds. I prefer settings like this. Just a small amount of people. Large crowds bother me. And that's not to say I'm like have social anxiety or anything like that. It's just who I am. But that's what was going on with Jesus. He did not want to be crowded by these thousands, potentially thousands of people that are following him. So Mark uses this word crowd twice in this verse. Now I point that out because there are actually two different words for crowd that Mark uses here. The word for crowd, the first time, it is that large crowd. But the word for crowd that we find at the end of the verse is that idea of crowding, where crowding causes difficulty for you. So Mark is using two different words here. It's the same in the English, but in the original language it's not. So Jesus knows he's going to have some difficulty with this crowd. He asks, get me a boat. Dean, go ahead. Yes, we're still in verse 9. Okay, you have the word crush there? That's good, because that would be a better translation of this. And the American Standard has the word crowd, but it is that idea of crowding to the point of suffocation, for lack of a better term. So, yes, crush, or I think some translations have the word afflict there at the end of verse 9. But that's the difficulty Jesus is seeking to avoid, not being crowded in by all these people. So again, he requests this boat. What does the boat accomplish? Exactly. He wants some space. In a situation like this where there's a lot of people around us, we would want space. Jesus is no different. So hence the request, get me a boat, have it ready for me. Questions or comments on verse 9? Okay. So in verse 10, why are all these people coming to him in this verse? He'd healed many. That's what the text says. And according to verse 10, what was the result? Okay, they pressed around him so they could touch him. All these people with various diseases of different sorts are all coming to Jesus to touch him. What is touching him? In their minds, what would touching him accomplish? To be healed. That's the obvious answer. In these people's minds, I want to touch Jesus. Just touching him will heal me. And there are isolated instances where we read that that does happen. The woman who touches the hem of his garment, which I'm not sure if it's in Mark or in another gospel at this time. But that's what people believe. Jesus was such a great healer that if they just touched him, they'd be healed. So all these people are coming to him, pressing in around him just to physically touch him. Again, verse 9, Jesus says, get me a boat. I'm not going to do this right now. Anything else on verse 10? Absolutely. Absolutely. Verse 10 does really illustrate verse 9. So that's a good observation. Anything else on verse 10? Yes. And yeah, the New American Standard has afflictions there, and that's just a word for like difficulties. But in this context, it'd be the difficulties caused by diseases or whatever was ailing the people. Anything else on verse 10? All right. So verse 9 and 10 talk about how part of this, people coming to Jesus, was because of his ability to heal. Verse 11, we see one example of the healings Jesus performed. What's the example here in verse 11? What was part of Jesus' healings? Okay, so yeah, getting demons out of people. In this verse, they're called unclean spirits, but they're one and the same. How did these unclean spirits respond to Jesus? They knew who he was. We already saw that in earlier chapters. If anybody recognized Jesus for who he really was, it was these unclean spirits. But also, as we discussed before, by recording this for us, Mark also wants his readers to latch onto this fact. Here's who Jesus is. Here, who is he? The Son of God. So even though Mark records the unclean spirits as saying this, Mark still records it because he wants his readers to latch on to who Jesus is. He's the Son of God. So, As the Son of God, what does this tell us about Jesus and his authority? He had it all. He's already demonstrated that authority. People have already seen him cast the unclean spirits out. They've already seen him forgive sins in one case. So it's this authority, though not yet recognized by the public, that would have also caused a large number of people to come to him. People would have recognized this Jesus fella has some authority about him that by implication comes from God. But it's the demons who recognize who Jesus really is, the Son of God. Questions or comments on verse 11? All right. So the demons, or the unclean spirits in this case,